This was dry brushed, and by the end of this video, you'll be able to achieve a similar result as I take you step by step through how to paint miniatures using oil paints. But before I began painting, I placed my oil paints on a piece of cardboard so it could absorb the excess oil. This simple step helps reduce the drying time and gives us a much more controlled and predictable workflow once the paint goes onto the miniature. After a couple minutes, I transferred the paints onto a disposable palette and lightly diluted them with white spirits, or in my case, odorless solvent. This dilution is not to turn the paint into a wash, but just so that it spreads more easily. The reason is that my first step will be to cover the entire model with a base coat of oil paint, and having the paint glide smoothly makes the process a lot easier. For the darker zones of the model, the deeper recesses and those hard to reach areas, I mixed in a little bit extra burnt umber. This gives the shadows a natural richness right from the beginning. And once the model was fully coated, I set it aside for about 15 minutes. This allows for the solvent to evaporate and the color to stain the surface. This staining effect is important for what comes next. You'll see why shortly. Once the paints have settled, I grab a makeup sponge and begin removing as much paint as possible. As you can see, even after wiping, a soft tint remains in the areas I clean. This is exactly what we want. A stained base that keeps our deepest shadows intact, while removing the excess paint sitting on the raised areas. The sponge won't reach into the recesses on its own, but having extra paint there isn't a problem. Those darker areas will work in our favor later on. For now, the goal is to simply remove paint without being too aggressive and scratching the surface. Here is how the model ended up looking after this step. A nice tinted foundation ready for the actual painting. So, using a flat brush, I mixed in a bit of white into my magenta and worked the paint thoroughly into the bristles. At the same time, I unloaded any extra paint, so that the brush had just the right amount. And once on the miniature, the painting itself is as easy as dry brushing, except that the colors blend wet on wet directly on the model. Because oil paints take much longer to dry than acrylics, instead of applying one layer over the other, the lighter tone we introduce will mix with the leftover base coat underneath. The brush, however, will start picking up some of those darker pigments, and slowly become dirty, which is perfectly normal. But let us pause and talk about the most common mistake people make moving forward. Do not reload your brush with more and more white paint, hoping the blend will continue getting brighter. If you continue adding more and more fresh paint onto the brush, you'll gradually overload the surface and end up with a muddy, unblendable mess, something I painfully learned the hard way. So, let's backtrack to where we were. We work the paint into the brush. Then we start blending the lighter tone with gentle dry brushing, and eventually the brush gets too dirty to continue working. That is your cue to step away from the miniature and clean the brush by unloading it on a paper towel or rag. Only after cleaning should you introduce a bit more white and continue blending. Think of it this way. As we blend, the brush both introduces paint and picks up paint. It gives and takes at the same time. The goal is to avoid adding more than we are removing. Now, up to this point, I've been using the same brush both for applying and blending because the area is large and I am simply establishing the overall volumes of the figure. But now, let's move to where the real magic begins, the smaller, more precise details. Here is how the model is looking so far. With a smaller brush, which will be my application brush, I begin placing dashes of pure white anywhere I want to enhance the highlight. Then, using the same flat brush from earlier, I blend the small dashes of white with soft, controlled dry brushing motions. But take into account that this blending brush has not touched any solvent. Just like before, it was cleaned with a paper towel, and the same is done every 2 or 3 blends, to keep the balance of the white I introduced with the paint that was already there. And even though the flat brush is quite large, by using only the very edge of the bristles, I can blend even on small and delicate areas. From here on, the process repeats. Apply small amounts of white and blend them while cleaning the brush every couple strokes, each time using a bit less paint than before. And layer by layer, the highlights get sharper and brighter until we reach the exact tone we're after. Now of course this model is almost entirely skin, which makes it the perfect candidate for this wet on wet technique. But that is exactly why I chose it, not because it would look good on camera, but because the technique suits the model and delivers the best result with the least amount of effort. I always enjoy exploring and teaching different techniques, not to find the best one, but to build a toolbox so you can always choose the right method for the right situation. painting like this is almost meditative. You are not rushing from step to step. You're just simply pushing paint around and letting the colors mix naturally. It's the kind of technique where you stop thinking about finishing the miniature, and instead you just enjoy the act of painting it. And I think that's something we forget too often. We get so focused on improving or keeping up with our backlog that we lose sight of why we started painting in the first place. But when you slow down like this, when you literally watch the color move under the brush, you are reminded that the process itself can be the reward. But trying new techniques isn't about just adding more skills to your toolbox. It's also about rediscovering what you enjoy about the hobby. A lot of us get stuck doing the same thing over and over because it's what we're used to doing. Base coat, shade, highlight, repeat. And even though it works, it can make the hobby feel like a chore instead of an escape. But when you pick up something new, especially something that behaves completely differently, it shakes you out of autopilot. Suddenly you're experimenting again. You are curious and you're not thinking what's the correct step. You start to think, what happens if I try this? And that mindset alone can reignite your creativity far more than the result ever will. And while doing that, you might notice that your mind starts to wander. Your shoulders relax and suddenly you're not thinking about your day or work or deadlines. You're just painting. That's a magic moment, the point where the hobby becomes restorative instead of demanding, where every brushstroke feels like you're emptying your head a little more, and filling the model with that energy instead. The only reason this moment exists is because you allowed yourself to try something different. You chose to experiment, to break the routine, and that choice is what brought you here. That's exactly why pushing yourself even just a little matters. Every new technique you explore isn't just a skill upgrade, it's an invitation to enjoy the hobby in a completely new way. Now let's address a common issue. What if you place too much white in an area? Something I have done more than once during this process. And blending it forces you to widen the transition so much that you lose some of the shadows. Well, just like with the highlights, we can do the exact same thing with darker tones. Apply small amounts and blend them right in using the same technique. But pay close attention to how I move my brush. You'll notice strokes going top to bottom, side to side, or even stippling. Each direction is chosen intentionally, either to maintain a thin shadow line or to avoid pushing the color into areas where I don't want it. And remember, I am still unloading my brush every 2 or 3 blends to keep the amount of paint consistent. Also, don't forget that our highlights are still wet as well, and that becomes very helpful in moments like this one. After cleaning the brush, I actually push the existing lighter color backwards into the shadow, completing the blend without spreading too much dark paint around. This avoids going back and forth endlessly and keeps the transition clean. You can push this technique as far as you want. Once you break the initial fear of working with oils, you'll find yourself having fun and taking bolder creative choices. Here, for example, using 4 different small dashes of color on the shoulder, I create subdivisions of the muscle simply by controlling the movement of my brush and leaving thin lines of colors between each segment. If you found this video interesting, I have 2 more tutorials on painting miniatures with oil paints which I'll link in the description. With that said, thank you for watching all the way till the end. I hope you give this a try and that it helps you out with your projects.